A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corn, listening to the situational report, very good update on the very significant developments that we've had today. And you mentioned in that episode about the shadow fleets, some of these ships that Iran is operating under false flags, literally false flags in this case, mentioning that the US added some additional sanctions today to those. And you mentioned in passing that these vessels often have their transponders disabled and they're aging. And for some reason, it made me think of Russia's use of these private military companies like the Wagner Group, which has also been in the news a bit recently. I'd love to chat about this whole phenomenon of nations that have been placed under sanction, like Iran, for example, turning to these shadow armies, literally, or sometimes shadow navies in this case, to operate and to, I think about the Wagner Group, it's often commented that it is used to add plausible deniability and really makes it hard to actually, at the surface level, see the extent of Russia's foreign policy interventions. So would love to chat about how that technique has been used by different countries around the world. On the surface of it, it seems like an almost extraordinarily audacious thing to do, to try to literally disguise an entire army through the mechanism of subterfuge and claiming that it's a private military organization, even when those ties are paper, like transparent paper. But clearly it's been a favorite technique and continues to be very relevant. So Herman and Corn, I'd love to get some more info about this from you two. Thanks.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to my weird prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother, who is currently surrounded by about 7 different maps of the Mediterranean, 4 charts of the South China Sea, and at least 3 open tabs on maritime insurance law from the 1970s. Herman, you look like you haven't slept since the last leap year.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are not exaggerating, Corn. I have been deep in the weeds on this one. My desk is a graveyard of sticky notes about gross tonnage and sovereign immunity. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, and it is a heavy hitter. He wants to talk about shadow armies and shadow navies, specifically how countries like Iran, Russia, and even China use these entities to bypass sanctions, project power, and maintain what the diplomats call plausible deniability. Daniel was listening to a recent situational report and heard us mention the shadow fleet that Iran uses to move oil, and he wanted us to really pull back the curtain on how these subterranean operations actually work in 2026.
It is such a fascinating and frankly kind of terrifying topic. We like to talk about the world as a place of clear borders, official state actors, and international treaties. But there is this massive parallel world of gray market ships, deniable mercenaries, and civilian militias that basically keeps the wheels of certain economies turning. It is like the entire global system has a hidden basement where all the real work gets done away from the cameras and the ledgers of the United Nations.
That is exactly what it is. And what is interesting about Daniel's prompt is that he pointed out how these ties are often like transparent paper. Everyone knows who is pulling the strings. The intelligence agencies know, the journalists know, and the rival governments know. Yet, the legal and diplomatic structures we have built are often powerless to stop it because of that tiny sliver of doubt or that complex layer of corporate shell companies. It is the "I'm not touching you" of international relations, but with billion-dollar oil tankers and heavy artillery.
So let's start with the Shadow Navy, because that is what Daniel mentioned first. When we talk about the Shadow Fleet, we are not just talking about a couple of rusty boats sneaking around at night. This is a massive, coordinated global operation. Herman, How does a country like Iran or Russia actually move millions of barrels of oil when the entire Western financial system is trying to block them?
It is a masterclass in obfuscation, corn. The Shadow Fleet, which some analysts call the Ghost Fleet or the Dark Fleet, consists of hundreds of vessels. As of early 2026, estimates suggest the total number of ships operating in this capacity has climbed over 1,400 globally. Most of these are older tankers, often 15 years or older. In the legitimate shipping world, that is usually when a ship is considered ready for the scrapyard because the maintenance costs and insurance premiums skyrocket. But for a shadow fleet, that is the sweet spot. These ships are bought through a dizzying series of shell companies based in places like the Marshall Islands, Liberia, or Panama. They use what are called flags of convenience.
Right. So the ship might be carrying Iranian crude, but it is registered in Panama, owned by a company in the British Virgin Islands that was created 3 weeks ago, and managed by a firm in Dubai that only has a PO box.
And the technical side of this is where it gets really wild. Every large commercial ship is required to have an automatic identification system, or AIS. It is a transponder that broadcasts the ship's position, speed, and identity to other ships and coastal authorities. It is a safety feature to prevent collisions. But the Shadow Fleet uses a technique called going dark. They simply turn off the transponder when they are in sensitive areas, like when they are approaching the Iranian coast or entering the Baltic Sea.
So they just disappear from the map.
Well, they disappear from the digital map, but they are still physically there, which is why it is so dangerous. What they do is they will sail into the middle of the ocean places like the Laconian Gulf off the coast of Greece or the waters off Morocco, turn off their AIS, and then meet up with another tanker. This is called a ship-to-ship transfer, or STS. The sanctioned tanker pumps its oil into a second tanker that is not under sanctions. By the time that second tanker pulls into a port in, say, China or India, its paperwork says the oil came from a completely different source, often blended with other oils to hide its chemical signature. Sometimes they even spoof their GPS coordinates using sophisticated electronic warfare tools to make it look like the ship is docked in one country while it is actually hundreds of miles away loading oil in a sanctioned port.
It is amazing that in 2026, with all the satellite surveillance we have, this still works. We actually touched on the tech side of this back in episode 5 and 67 when we talked about satellite deception, but it seems like the scale has just exploded recently. Why can't we just look at the satellite photos and say, hey, there's the ship?
Because there are tens of thousands of ships on the ocean at any given time. Identifying one specific tanker among thousands, then proving its ownership through 5 layers of shell companies, and then finding a legal jurisdiction willing to seize it is a Herculean task. Russia, since the invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent oil price caps and sanctions, has built a shadow fleet that is now estimated at over 700 ships. These are ships that operate entirely outside the reach of Western insurance companies. That is a huge detail, Korn. Most ships need protection and indemnity insurance, P&I insurance from the international group in London to enter major ports. The Shadow Fleet uses obscure, state-backed insurance from Russia or Iran, or sometimes no insurance at all.
That sounds like an environmental disaster waiting to happen. If one of these old, uninsured tankers has a spill in the English Channel or the Malacca Strait, who pays for the cleanup?
No one. That is the scary part. We are essentially seeing a degradation of maritime safety standards as a direct byproduct of geopolitical conflict. We saw a near miss in the Danish Straits just last year where a shadow tanker lost power and almost ran aground. If that ship had split open, the cleanup costs would have fallen on the Danish taxpayers because the ship's owners are essentially ghosts. But for countries like Iran and Russia, the risk of an oil spill is secondary to the risk of their economy collapsing under the weight of sanctions. It is about survival.
So that is the Shadow Navy. Let's pivot to the Shadow Armies, because that is the other side of Daniel's prompt. We've all heard of the Wagner Group, which became a household name during the conflict in Ukraine. But the concept of a private military company, a PMC being used as a tool of state power, is something that has evolved quite a bit, hasn't it? It isn't just about mercenaries anymore.
It has evolved from a convenience into a core pillar of foreign policy. The Wagner Group at its height was the perfect example of plausible deniability. For years, the Kremlin denied any official link to Yevgeny Prigozhin's organization. They would say, oh, these are just private citizens, patriots who are volunteering their time or working for a private business. This allowed Russia to intervene in places like Syria, Libya, the Central African Republic, and Mali without officially putting Russian boots on the ground. It allowed them to engage in combat, secure resources, and prop up friendly regimes while keeping the official Russian military death toll at zero.
And the benefit there is that if a Wagner soldier gets captured or killed, the state doesn't have to take responsibility. There are no flag-draped coffins coming home to official ceremonies, and there is no diplomatic fallout because, technically, it wasn't the Russian army. It's the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for international intervention.
Right. It lowers the political cost of war, but as Daniel noted in his prompt, that deniability is often paper thin. In places like Africa, Wagner didn't just provide security, they took over gold and diamond mines. They became an economic engine for the Kremlin, helping them bypass sanctions by extracting physical wealth, gold bars, and raw diamonds that doesn't rely on the SWIFT banking system. They were essentially a sovereign state's dark ops division disguised as a corporation.
I'm curious about the transition we've seen lately. After the whole Prigozhin mutiny in 2023 and his subsequent death, has the shadow army model changed? Is it still a shadow, or has it just become a direct arm of the state?
It is moving toward what analysts are calling the Africa Corps now. The Russian Ministry of Defense has essentially taken direct control of those assets. But the interesting thing is they are still trying to maintain that layer of separation when it suits them. They want the power of a state army with the flexibility and lack of accountability of a private group. They've rebranded, but the mission remains the same. Project influence in the global south, secure mineral resources, and push out Western influence, all while maintaining enough distance that they can claim they aren't invading anyone.
It reminds me of the discussion we had in episode 757 about the operational fusion between Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, and groups like Hezbollah or the Houthis. It is that same idea where the line between a state actor and a proxy group becomes so blurry that it is effectively non-existent, yet diplomatically it remains a useful fiction.
That is exactly the phrase, a useful fiction. And it isn't just Russia and Iran. We have to talk about China's maritime militia, which is perhaps the most sophisticated shadow navy in existence. They call them Little Blue Men, a play on the Little Green Men Russia used in Crimea. China has thousands of fishing boats that are part of the People's Armed Forces maritime militia. These aren't just fishermen. They are trained, funded, and commanded by the People's Liberation Army.
So they're fishing for, what? Geopolitical leverage?
They use these fishing boats to swarm disputed areas in the South China Sea, like the Second Thomas Shoal or Whitsun Reef. They will anchor hundreds of boats together to create a floating wall. If a Philippine or Vietnamese Coast Guard vessel tries to push them out, China says, you are harassing our innocent fishermen who have been in these waters for centuries, but those fishermen are equipped with advanced communications, high-pressure water cannons, and sometimes even small arms. If the Philippines sends a Navy ship to clear them, China can claim the Philippines is the aggressor, escalating a civilian dispute into a military one.
It is a way of winning without fighting, or at least fighting below the threshold that would trigger a full-scale military response. If you send a destroyer, it is an act of war. If you send 500 fishing boats to sit on a reef and refuse to move, it is a diplomatic nuisance that slowly becomes a new reality on the ground.
It is called salami slicing. You take small, incremental steps that aren't quite enough to start a war, but over time, they completely change the strategic map. By the time the international community reacts, you've already built a military base on a reef that used to be underwater, and you did it all using civilian assets.
Let's talk more about the mechanism of how these groups are funded. If you are under heavy sanctions, how do you pay 10,000 mercenaries or maintain a fleet of 700 tankers? You mentioned mining in Africa, but there has to be a more complex financial web behind this.
There is. It involves a massive network of front companies and money laundering. For the Shadow Fleet, a lot of the payments happen in non-dollar currencies. We see a lot of trade happening in Chinese yuan or Indian rupees. Sometimes it is even direct barter. Russia might trade oil for consumer goods, electronics, or machinery. In the case of Iran, they use a system called the Hawala network. a traditional, trust-based money transfer system that leaves no digital paper trail. It's essentially an underground banking system that predates modern finance and is nearly impossible for Western regulators to track.
And what about the people running these companies? Are they just career criminals, or are they intelligence officers?
It is a mix of both. Often you have former intelligence officers who understand how to set up clandestine networks, and they partner with businessmen who are willing to take high risks for high rewards. In the case of the Shadow Fleet, there are shipbrokers in Dubai, Hong Kong, and Singapore who have made absolute fortunes in the last few years by facilitating the sale of these old tankers to anonymous buyers. It is a gold rush for the unscrupulous. They charge massive premiums because they know the buyers have no other options.
It seems like the Western response to this has been a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. You sanction 10 ships, and 10 more pop up under different names. You sanction one PMC, and they rebrand as 3 different security firms. Is there any way to actually stop this? Or is this just the new reality of a multipolar world where the old rules don't apply?
It is incredibly difficult to stop. The United States and its allies have been trying to tighten the noose. Just in the last few months of 2025 and early 2026, there were new sanctions announced targeting the Shadow Fleet specifically. They are starting to sanction the individual vessels by their IMO numbers, that is the International Maritime Organization number, which is like a VIN for a car. It stays with the ship even if the name, the flag, or the owner changes.
So the ship itself becomes a persona non grata.
Right. If a ship is on the sanctions list, no reputable port will let it dock, and no reputable company will provide it with fuel, spare parts, or even fresh water. But the Shadow Fleet responds by using even more remote locations for their ship-to-ship transfers. They do it in the middle of the Atlantic or in the Indian Ocean where there is no local coast guard to watch them. They are essentially creating an entire parallel maritime infrastructure, their own ports, their own repair yards, their own insurance. That is completely invisible to traditional law enforcement.
What about the legal side of the shadow armies? If a Wagner group or an Iranian-backed militia commits a war crime, is there any mechanism to hold the state responsible if they are maintaining that plausible deniability?
That is the million-dollar question. In international law, there is a concept called effective control. If you can prove that a state had effective control over a group, meaning they gave the orders, provided the weapons, and directed the strategy, the state can be held liable. But proving that in a court of law, with the level of secrecy these groups use, is incredibly hard. This is why the deniability is so valuable. It creates a legal fog that can take decades to clear, by which time the political situation has usually changed anyway. The victims in places like Syria or Mali are left with no one to sue and no one to hold accountable.
It feels like we are moving back toward a world of privateers and mercenaries, almost like the 17th century. Back then, empires like the British or the Dutch would give letters of marque to private ship captains to attack their enemies. It was state-sponsored piracy.
That is a brilliant comparison, Corn. We are seeing the return of the letter of marque, just in a digital and corporate form. Instead of a captain with a wooden ship and a cannon, it is a CEO of a shell company with a fleet of rust bucket tankers and a bank account in a tax haven. The logic is identical. The state gets the benefit of the action without the responsibility of the conduct. It is a regression of international norms. We spent 200 years trying to move away from that model and centralize the use of force in the hands of accountable states, and now we are watching it all unravel.
I want to go back to something Daniel mentioned about Iran specifically. He talked about the situational report regarding the Shadow Fleet and the recent developments. Iran has become incredibly sophisticated at this. We talked about their missile program in episode 718, and it seems like they apply that same level of engineering and technical cleverness to their smuggling operations.
They really do. Iran has been under some form of sanctions for decades, so they have had more time than anyone to perfect this. They have what they call the resistance economy. They have built their own domestic versions of everything from car parts to software, and their smuggling networks are integrated directly into their state intelligence apparatus. When we talk about the Shadow Fleet, we are talking about a multi-billion-dollar enterprise that is managed with the precision of a military operation. They use honeypot ships to distract monitors while the real tankers slip through. They use decoy transponders that broadcast from a different location. It's a shell game played on a global scale.
And the role of technology here is a double-edged sword, isn't it? On one hand, we have better satellite tracking and AI that can identify ships based on their hull shape even if they turn off their transponders. But on the other hand, the smugglers are using the same tack to spoof their locations and hide their identities.
It is a constant arms race. There are companies now that specialize in dark ship detection. They use synthetic aperture radar, SAR, which can see through clouds and at night to find ships that have turned off their AIS. They use machine learning to analyze the wake of a ship or its thermal signature to identify it. But then the shadow fleet starts using decoy ships or they travel in high traffic lanes to blend in with legitimate commerce. It is hide and seek on a global scale. And the stakes are trillions of dollars in oil and the stability of global energy markets.
You know, what strikes me is that this isn't just about avoiding sanctions. It is about creating a world where the rules don't apply to everyone equally. If you are a legitimate shipping company, you follow the rules. You pay for insurance. You maintain your ships to high standards. But if you are part of the Shadow Fleet, you have a massive competitive advantage because you are cutting all those corners. You're not paying for safety inspections. You're not paying for proper insurance. And you're not paying taxes.
It distorts the entire market. And it creates these weird pockets of the world that are essentially lawless. Look at the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden. You have this mix of legitimate trade, Shadow Fleet tankers, and pirate activity all happening in the same waters. It is a recipe for chaos. And because these ships are often in poor condition, they are more likely to break down, which creates even more opportunities for piracy or accidents.
Let's talk about the human cost for a second. Who are the people working on these ships or in these shadow armies? It can't be a great career path.
For the Shadow Fleet, it is often sailors from developing countries. India, the Philippines, Bangladesh, who are willing to take the risk for a higher paycheck. But they are in a terrible position. If the ship gets seized or has an accident, they have no legal protection. We've seen cases where sailors have been abandoned on shadow tankers for months with no food or pay because the shell company that owned the ship simply vanished. As for the shadow armies, it is a mix of ideological recruits, people with no other economic options, and in the case of Wagner, literally thousands of recruited prisoners. It is a meat grinder. The state uses these people as disposable assets. If they die, they don't exist.
It is a dark irony that the very thing that makes these groups effective, their lack of official status, is also what makes the people inside them so vulnerable. They are ghosts in the system.
That is a great way to put it. They are ghosts. And that brings us back to Daniel's point about the audacity of it. To literally disguise an entire army or an entire navy through the mechanism of subterfuge is an incredibly bold move. It challenges the very idea of the nation state as we understand it. If a state can do whatever it wants through a proxy and never face consequences, then what is the point of international law? What is the point of a treaty if you can just hire a private company to break it for you?
It feels like we are seeing the limits of the post-World War II order. That order was built on the idea of clear state responsibility and the Westphalian system of sovereign nations. But in 2026, that concept is being eroded every day by these gray zone tactics.
It really is. And the Shadow Fleet is just the most visible manifestation of it. There are shadow financial networks, shadow cyber armies, and even shadow diplomatic channels. We are living in an era of deep complexity where the surface level of politics is often just a performance for the public, while the real power is being exercised in these hidden spaces. It's a return to a more cynical, more fractured way of doing business.
So, if you were a policymaker in Washington or Brussels, how do you even begin to tackle this? If the whack-a-mole strategy isn't working, is there a more systemic approach?
Some people are calling for a more aggressive maritime enforcement policy. Instead of just sanctioning ships, you actually seize them if they are found to be operating without insurance or with spoofed AIS. You treat them as a threat to maritime safety, like a floating bomb. But that carries a huge risk of escalation. If you seize an Iranian tanker, they might seize a Western one in retaliation, which we have seen happen in the Strait of Hormuz multiple times.
Right, the tanker wars of the 1980s all over again.
So most countries prefer the economic approach, trying to make it so expensive and difficult to operate a shadow ship that it eventually becomes non-viable. They are targeting the middlemen, the banks, the insurers, the ship management companies. If you can cut off the support system, the shadow fleet eventually rusts away. But as long as there is a buyer for the oil and a seller who needs the money, someone will find a way to move it. It is the basic law of supply and demand, just applied to global smuggling.
It makes me think about the future of warfare and competition. We often imagine the next big conflict will be about high-tech drones and cyber attacks, and it will be, but it will also be about these low-tech, gritty, subterranean operations. It is about who can hide their tracks the best, and who can operate longest in the shadows.
I think you are right, Corn. The future is less about a clean, decisive battle and more about a long, grinding war of attrition in the gray zone. It is about which side can maintain its economy and its influence while being under constant pressure. In that world, the Shadow Army and the Shadow Navy aren't just sideshows. They are the main event. They are the tools that allow a state to keep fighting when it should have been defeated by economic sanctions or diplomatic isolation.
It is a sobering thought, but it also highlights why it is so important to understand these mechanisms. If we just look at the official news, we are only seeing half the story. Daniel's prompt really gets to the heart of what is happening behind the scenes. It's about the infrastructure of power that doesn't want to be seen.
It really does. And it is something we need to keep a close eye on. The scale of these operations is only growing. We are seeing more and more countries look at the Russian and Iranian models and think, hey, maybe we should have a shadow fleet too. It is becoming a standard part of the toolkit for any nation that wants to challenge the status quo. Even smaller nations are starting to experiment with these tactics to bypass regional blocks or trade in illicit goods.
I'm also thinking about the role of private corporations in all of this. We focus on the states, but there are thousands of private companies that are facilitating this trade, whether they know it or not. Sometimes it is deliberate, but sometimes it is just a lack of due diligence.
That is a huge part of it. The complexity of global shipping is so great that it is very easy to hide a few dozen shadow tankers among the tens of thousands of legitimate ones. A company might think they are buying oil from a legitimate trader in Malaysia, but that trader is just a front for a ship-to-ship transfer that happened a week earlier in the middle of the ocean. The layers of deception are incredibly deep. It requires a level of forensic accounting and intelligence gathering that most private companies simply aren't equipped for.
It is like a fractal. The closer you look, the more complexity you find. You think you found the source, but it is just another shell company.
And that is by design. The goal of subterfuge isn't to be perfectly invisible, it is just to be expensive enough to investigate that most people won't bother. If you make the trail long enough and complicated enough, you win. You don't need to be a ghost, you just need to be a ghost that is too expensive to hunt.
Well, Herman, I think we have pulled back as much of the curtain as we can for today. It is a fascinating and complex world, and I'm sure we'll be coming back to this as more of these shadow operations come to light. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of how the unseen world actually operates.
Definitely. There is always more to dig into, and I want to make sure we mention the broader implications for global trade. If this continues, we might see a permanent split in the maritime world, a regulated, insured, high-standard fleet for the West, and a dark, unregulated, high-risk fleet for everyone else. That would have massive consequences for everything from the price of goods to the safety of our oceans. We're talking about a balkanization of the sea.
It is a two-tier system for a two-tier world. Not exactly the globalized utopia we were promised in the 90s, is it?
Not even close. But it is the world we have in 2026. It's a world where the shadows are getting longer and more crowded.
Well, on that slightly ominous note, I think it's time to wrap things up. This has been a deep dive into the shadow worlds of global power. Herman, any final thoughts before we sign off?
Just that it is worth remembering that even though these things happen in the shadows, they have very real-world consequences. Whether it is the price of gas at the pump, the environmental safety of our coastlines, or the security of a country in Africa, the shadow armies and navies are shaping the world we live in every single day. They aren't just stories. They are the engines of modern geopolitics.
Very true. And a huge thank you to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It really pushed us to look at the mechanisms of power in a different way. If you are listening and you have a topic you want us to explore, no matter how weird or hidden, please get in touch. We love diving into these complex, weird, and often hidden parts of our world.
We really do. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. You can also visit our website at myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed for subscribers and a contact form if you want to reach out. And of course, you can always email us at show@myweirdprompts.com.
And hey, if you've been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a quick review or a rating on your podcast app. It genuinely helps new listeners find us and keeps the show growing. We love hearing from you and seeing the community grow.
Also, if you want to dig deeper into some of the related topics we mentioned today, I highly recommend checking out episode 738 on Mossad's sabotage of Iran's air defenses. It is a great look at the other side of this shadow war, the intelligence and sabotage side.
That is a good one. It really pairs well with this discussion. Alright, that is it for us today. Our show music was generated with Suno. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth